Well, we told you that history's fantastic, but without cast of characters, history really is nothing. And so today we find ourselves right here inside the beautiful home of Joni Harms, and thank you so much for letting us be here. And this is an amazing place. This is the Harms homestead. And the cast of characters are right here, and we're going to get to know them a little bit right now. So, Harv, why don't you start? Tell us your name and a little bit about the time you've been here.
Well, my name is Harv Hansen. LH stands for Lawrence Harvey, but I go by Harv. Anyway, I'm 86 years old, and I feel good.
All right. That's the best part right there, right?
Yeah, you betcha.
Good.
Hello, my name is Dan Harms. Here's the Harms homestead, so it relates to me through my dad and my grandpa. And I'm also related to the Gribbles. So, and I'm 73 years old, and I've been here my entire life.
Fantastic.
I'm Judy E. Wolfer, and I'm from the Marks Prairie area. And Harvey and I were growing up in the same area and part of the Marks Prairie community. The Wolfer family arrived in the area around 1856, but they were related to the Mark family, but actually we're going to be talking about the Marks family today. And they arrived here in 1847. So I'm not going to tell you my age.
And that's okay.
My name's Glenn Kraxberger. I grew up about 3/4 of a mile south of here, kind of in the heart of Macksburg, and our family came in 1892.
Doc?
I'm Doc Harms. I'm 84 years old. Again, I'm related to the Harms family and the Gribble family that settled here in 1847. And his mom said the apples didn't fall very far from the tree because we're still on the homesteads.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Ken Daniels, and my mother was a Harms, and I grew up on a corner of this homestead right here, and I'm 78 years old.
Wow. So there's the cast and characters. And now let's get into the meat of it. So you might have heard of Canby, of course, but what about Macksburg? What about Marks Prairie? Have you ever heard of that? And all the Gribble barn and all of that stuff. Well, we're going to touch on all of those pieces, but nothing exists without the characters and the stories that go along with it. So Judy, let's start with you. So just a brief history of this community. Let's start there.
Well, in 1847, I believe it was October of that year, the Marks came out from Missouri, Illinois, Pennsylvania, that area, and they actually settled a donation land claim there called, well, there were several of them. It was the Mark donation land claim, but there was also the James Shirley donation land claim, which was side by side. But the Marks donation land claim was in 1847, as I said earlier. And James Shirley was married to Lavina, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Mark. So with the Mark family taking up so much of the area, that's how Marks Prairie got its name. They just named it Marks Prairie because there was John Marks, there was Alexander Kesterson Marks, and then there was James Shirley. So that whole area was called Marks Prairie. Right. And that's how we gained the name of Marks Prairie.
So how was and anybody can answer this, but How was the land purchased? Who owned it when the settlers started coming in? How did who dealt in land? Was it the federal government at the time, or let's hear just a little bit about that. Anybody?
Well, it was the federal government because they are the ones, in fact, it was Andrew Johnson that had signed some of the documents that I have in my possession. They were able to trade a wagon and a yoke of oxen for 640 acres. That was John Mark. And then Alexander Kesterson Mark is where the Marks Prairie Schoolhouse sits. He traded 320. As part of that, he claimed it. He only was able to have 320 acres because he was a single man. And this was before he married. So he could not get the 640 like John, his father and mother, were able to. So that's how the 320 acres was acquired, and later we'll go into how the schoolhouse was built and so on.
Right. So the original group of people that came to this area were just off the wagons, right? I mean, they just had come over, Dan, you were mentioning a little bit about that.
Yes, on my side, on the Gribble side, they started out in the May of '46 and arrived at Foster Farms, which is Eagle Creek, in late September of that same year. With winter coming on, they stayed there. There was accommodations for a lot of people to stay at Foster's place. It says like there was only like 20 houses in Portland at that time. So they stayed there till spring, and then the men came out, made their way through the valley, and found Gribble Prairie over here. It was not completely wooded. It was an open expanse, sort of. So that's where the prairie comes in. So they didn't have to do a lot of labor to clear the ground. They could start right away. See, it was my third great grandpa. Is that right?
That's right.
That came here, and he had 8 kids, and he had one son, Andrew, which would be my second great grandpa, and he was also married. So if you were married, you could claim 640 acres. So they settled on about 1,400 acres total over in Gribble Prairie.
Wow.
And also in that same wagon train was Elliott, which turns in to be Elliott Prairie.
Yes.
So
that's where I live.
That's where
Elliott
you live.
Prairie, yeah.
Yes. And so that's how these prairies came to be,
Interesting.
And so that's enough right now.
Yeah.
I think.
So who was Mark then? So it's Mark's Prairie, but who, I know you talked a little bit about that, but was Mark a last name then?
Yes, Marks. They actually came as Marks. Some of the family dropped the S on their name. So it was actually called Marks Prairie with the S on the name. But they were the ones, John Mark, Alexander Kesterson Mark, and James Shirley married Lavina Marks. So that was the Marks family that came across on the wagon train in 1847.
How about Maddox?
Maddox was a cousin of, because there was a Mark that had married a Maddox, and I don't recall who the Mark was right now, but yes, that's how Maddox became a part of the dairy farm there, Vestamark and Roland Maddox.
Okay. So Doc, what are your memories? Some of the things that you remember
Well, I was the last class to attend the Maxburg grade school. It was a beautiful country school, had an upstairs gymnasium, a stage, 2 classrooms, but by the time I started right in 1945, we used to use one part of it. There were 23 of us in the school.
23.
But they consolidated the next year with Canby. And then, of course, we all came in. The high school was going at the time, but there were kids in the 8th grade that were 16 years old when I was going. But it was quite an adventure. I had a lot of cousins going there, and I was the littlest one of the whole darn bunch. And I remember the teacher would ring the bell, and if you weren't in your seat when that bell rung, she kind of swatted your tail, you know. Well, I got there and sat down, and one of my cousins picked me up and threw me out the window. So I had come in as the bell was ringing, and I got my butt swatted.
Hey,
It was
Mike.
board education back then.
Yeah.
You know, all of us that consolidated with Canby, we didn't realize, I didn't realize that that was your first day, or
Yeah.
the same as me. You know, I thought you had been there forever.
No.
Yeah. We had no idea that Lone Elder and Maxburg and Marks Prairie and,
Then we got Central Point out there.
yeah,
All
that many
consolidated.
kids that were new.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't know that.
When did that school go up? I mean,
Oh,
was it
boy,
shortly
back in
after?
late 1800s.
Late 1800s. Yeah. And you were the last grade through that school.
Right.
And so I'm just thinking 23, students in that school. So how many, the acreage that you got, like 640 acres, that's a lot of acreage. So there were, the population wasn't huge, but it was a very desirable place to be, right? The Willamette Valley, kind of the mouth of the Willamette Valley, or the front end of it, right?
Yeah, it was in a one-room school, and first graders in the first row. We didn't have any second graders. Then there were third graders, 2 fourth graders, 5 or 6 fifth graders, and 10 or 12 seventh and eighth graders, just spaced off. We went through 3 teachers in 1 year.
One of the things to add to that too is there was another school before the Maxburg school. It had to be not early in 1800s, but when they first came here, and our great grandfather moved the school right over here about 100 feet from where we're sitting right now, and it was the granary. When I was a kid, it was the granary here, and it was the old Maxburg school. It got moved here.
Really?
And you could see some evidence of where kids chalk marks and things in that.
Mike talks
Granary.
about, I'm sorry, Ken. Mike talks about Maxburg when he was the last and there was 23 people there. I have a picture of the 1905 or 6 classmates that were there. And to show you the difference, there must have been 60 or 70 kids in that school at
Oh, wow.
that time.
Wow.
Every area had a school. That's kind of what didn't come first, but you could just go down a list, like Lone Elder, Maxburg, EB, Marks Prairie. Just keep
Forget
going.
Whiskey Hill.
Whiskey Hill, that's where my kids
Whiskey
went.
Hill.
Oh, they changed it to 91, I'd rather call it Whiskey Hill anyway.
But back in those days, people had large families.
Yeah.
So that,
And most of them were within walking distance. Schools are a mile or a mile and a half apart.
Yeah.
Lone Elder, Maxburg, Marks Prairie, EB, Dryland, Ruldell, all those schools were a mile or
We're
so
just-
apart and took in an area.
One of the things that's people, it's a trivia actually, but Molalla when I went to high school, Molalla was a bigger high school than Canby High School. And it had 23 grade schools that went into
Is
Molalla
that
High
right?
School, Malino,
23.
and Wildcat, and of course, we're not talking about Molalla, but it's hard to imagine that Molalla
Was bigger
the
than.
town was smaller, but the school was bigger. There was a different sports classification.
I'll be darned. So it's true then. All those stories about, I used to walk 2 miles to
That's-
school. That was true.
That was true.
Yeah, we walked it.
Well, in talking with Frank Cutsforth, in fact, Frank is really the one that spearheaded this whole idea. And so we're grateful for that, of course. But he said not only, now I've learned that there's schools like in every area or in a lot of the different areas, but there were baseball teams.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Baseball teams from a certain area, right? And so I can't imagine, but baseball, of course, the all-American sport, right? And does anybody remember watching or,
Well, I played
Yeah.
on some
You
of those
played?
baseball teams way back when.
In the
When Lone
50s.
Elder had a semi-pro team. Maxburg had a team. The Gribble family were all baseball enthusiasts. And there were 9 boys in the Gribble family, so they had a baseball
so
team.
they had a whole team.
But the other thing a lot of people don't know, that Ralph Coleman, the Oregon State baseball coach, was a graduate of Canby High School
Is that right?
and
Oh,
played
darn.
baseball with my uncles on the Gribble side.
Wow.
But the Canby Fire Department had a team, Lone Elder had a team, every little burg had a team, and that was a Sunday afternoon gathering. The teams from Portland liked to play Lone Elder because it's right there now where my vet clinic is where the baseball field used to be. And lo and behold, there was a tavern right across the street.
So that's why they like to come and play.
Somehow a cake of beer got set up on home plate after the game was over.
Well, and they were around a long time because Dan and Mike's dad played baseball for Lone Elder, and so did their Uncle Jack
Yeah.
Harms. And then you can name people all over the neighborhood that was a big deal. I can remember in the spring when they prepare the diamond, and we're talking about Lone Elder, but it's close. My brother and I'd pick up arrowheads in the ball diamond.
Wow. Wow.
And then there's behind Lone Elder School, it was there, torn down now, was lots of Indian artifacts, and we picked them up all over the place.
I'll be darned.
My uncle John Harms, Joni's dad, he was an avid
Collector.
of arrowheads and
Yeah.
artifacts. And just found out here in the fields. Still
Right
do
out
it.
there.
Still do, probably. Yeah, yeah. Glenn, how about you? What do you remember any of that?
Not too much of that. Our family were latecomers. We got here in 1892. My great-grandfather bought 156 acres from Henry Coomer, just down the road here, about a mile. And eventually all of his kids came from Austria and ended up here on the farm. And so there was 7 boys and 2 girls, so we kind of spread out quickly.
Right. And that's Gribble, right?
No, that's Cracksburg.
Cracksburger. Okay. Apologize. And so Cracksburger, were there a lot of Cracksburgers?
Well, like I say, 7 boys and 2 girls. All
Yeah. So they fanned out, right? Yeah.
They were all, like I said, they were all born in Austria, but they were all here in 1892.
1882.
You can always tell how we're represented because there's a Cracksburger Road, and there's
Yep.
a Harms Road.
That's right. Yeah.
When I was
And Mark
road named
Road
after
too. I
Right.
mean,
Gribble
right.
Road, I
Right.
think they're
Gribble
all
Road.
Now, was
Gribble
Mark
Road.
Road always Mark Road, or did it get?
as far as I know.
No,
I don't-
back in actually it didn't, to my knowledge, it didn't have a name way back, but if it did, I don't know what it was. But in 1978, John Nealon, the postmaster at Canby, he became the new postmaster in 1978. He actually named Mark Road.
Mark Road.
And he also set all the house numbers on Mark Road.
Is that right?
And that was in 1978.
So that's not that. Yeah,
that
not
was pretty
long
late.
ago.
But prior to that, I know that the Marks was actually the family that had the road put in so that all the neighboring families could get their students over to the school instead of going across the fields or walking across the fields. So, yeah.
So are there other families? I mean, obviously the families that we've talked about made a huge, had a huge influence on this area. Are there other families that did too?
There was a lot of the Wolfer family
Wolfer,
and the
right.
Zimmerman family that had a big influence on the area because the Wolfers and the Zimmermans actually had, the Wolfers had the bake ovens on their property, which was part of Marks Prairie and the James Shirley donation land claim. They had the bake ovens for Aurora in a little canyon behind their property, and the people from Aurora would come over once a week and do all their baking in those bake ovens and then go back to Aurora.
Yeah.
And that's always been kind of mind-blowing to me, thinking they came out all that distance from Aurora to do their baking.
Wow.
And then the Zimmermans had a shoe factory. They actually made shoes. They had another, boy, I forgot. Oh, they had hops. They had a hop dryer on their property there in Marks Prairie. And so the hops and potatoes were the kind of crops that they had there mostly, and so they had a hop dryer on their property.
On their property, yeah.
So that's how the Wolfers and the Zimmermans all become connected also to the Mark family, because John Coleman Mark married Kate Wolfer. So there was the Wolfers and the Marks and the Zimmermans.
Interesting. So you mentioned hops. One of the fantastic things about the Willamette Valley is it's so diverse in its the produce that it is manufactured or farmed here. What are some of the other crops that were prominent other than hops? Because we still see remnants of the hops. You know, they're not certainly gone. There's still a lot of them on both sides of 99. But
one thing that's interesting about that is you're right. It seems like not literally everybody, but different crops were popular, and whatever made them go away, I don't know. But when one of the first things, like in Canby, it was asparagus. Believe it or not, they raised it. Then
Peas.
You guys can help me. It came along. They had flax.
Flax.
And not literally, but you look around. Every farmer's got there's them flax stacked in the field. Then peas, and they had where the Canby Adult Center is now. They had a pea viner, as we called it, where they processed peas. And so at certain times of the year, you look around and every farmer raising, for a certain amount of years, raising peas. Yeah. And then,
so like snap
Gilbert's
peas, like
now.
Yes.
peas.
Yeah,
Okay,
they shell them.
Canning
okay,
peas
they shelled them there.
Peas were big, and flax was big, and
during the war.
turkeys. Then that's not a crop, but
Yeah,
was a
certainly.
time-
It is.
Yeah.
All kinds
It
of
was.
berries.
everybody
Berries.
had
I was
turkey.
going to say strawberries
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
Oh, that-
Do you guys remember Marshall strawberries?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Sure.
sure.
They were
Great
good.
big
weren't
ones
they? They
from
were
Mark.
huge.
Yeah.
They didn't have a very good shelf
Yeah,
life,
but
but
they were
boy,
good.
I'll tell you what, they were so good.
About the
So
only,
berries. What? And now there's a lot of fruit trees, you know, in the valleys. Certainly hazelnuts, but you know, apples, pears. Did they begin to develop orchards back then, or was it mostly the field crops?
Most of the farmers had orchards.
Okay, so they had
Around
their
the
personal
farmhouse.
use.
for
most
their own
everybody
personal use.
Yeah.
Had apple trees, pear trees, cherry trees, so forth.
Yeah.
And the crops, like I said, the flax during World War II was big. You have the Lone Elder Stutzman's farms now. Those are all flax sheds
Those are okay.
where the farmers would raise their flax, take it in there, have it processed, because Belgium at the time of World War II was the world's largest producers of flax linen. So
Oh.
Molalla had a flax plant, Mount Angel had one, Canby had one, but the Canby area was the largest in growing flax during World War II, and especially maybe for the next 5 or 6 years after that. But then, as the world markets changed, so did the growing of the crops
crops,
here in the
yeah.
valley. And the peas, they started developing harvesters that could harvest them in the fields. Plus, there's big competition coming from the Milton
Interesting.
Freewater,
Yeah. Milton Freewater. Yeah.
Wallowa area, or Walla Walla area over there, and but those were the crops for us as kids. We had work to do. We harvested berries, we harvested peas, we picked the hops, we shocked the flax, whatever you wanted to call it. But those were the work that we did back then. And then some of the ground down around the better ground started going into row crops. We started raising sweet corn, broccoli, cauliflower, things
Later.
like that. Where the Canby Eccles school set was one of the biggest asparagus gardens in the country. The
Wow.
school's on that property now.
So the train that goes through Canby now, it was used a lot to haul produce and the things that were grown here, right? I mean, because there was a stop there and
Especially when there's no refrigeration or anything. A horse and buggy took too long to get to Oregon City. And
to get to, I see,
Steamboat before that took way too long, so the train made a big
made
difference.
a big
taking
difference
crops.
there. Yeah.
I want to go back to the pea harvest.
Yes.
Well, when peas were right, you harvested them around the clock.
Around the clock.
There was no stopping. One year, Mike was, well, I was about, I imagine 6 or 7, and like Ken said, they put you in the truck, start to throttle up and put it in compound, and you'd sit there, couldn't reach a pedal, but you'd drive the truck. Come to a corner, somebody would turn the truck around. Well, Mike, and you'd load these on the trucks. There'd be a couple guys on the truck just mounding them up full length of the truck. One morning, Mike was running a load into town. He stopped by the house to get a bite to eat or something.
Let Mom out.
And it was out on the main road, and somehow he grabbed the wrong lever, I do believe.
Mom kicked it.
Mom,
Blame it on Mom.
anyways, he unloaded the nicest stack of peas right in the middle of the road as he drove away.
We used to get 1,500, 2,000 pounds of shelled peas out of that. When Otto Kraxberger Jr. came up with the tractor, he's the only one around that had a lift. And we loaded it back on, and we got less than 1,000 pounds.
My mother would never brag, but I could brag for it. She used to pick hops, and so did everybody else, but in the 40s, and she picked hops for Glenn's grandpa, and by the church, and she made $110 in 3.5 days, I remember that, in 1940.
That's a lot of money.
She
That's,
worked,
that's a lot of money for
she
in
worked
those
hard
days.
though, Ken.
Yeah.
She was always that way.
Daylight till dark, but
So they were grown the same way they are, up,
Not as high.
not as high.
Not as high.
So did he have to have a ladder to pick them, or was it all
No,
on
they could
foot?
reach
No,
What we
Let
did,
the line
what
down.
they had hooks that held the wire up, and when you were picking them, they come by and lift that wire up and let it down,
Yeah.
so you could stand there and pick it. And there was one guy, that's all he did, was go lift and let those lines down so somebody
I
could pick
can
them.
still hear
in
that.
big baskets.
somebody holler, I can still hear that, wire down, somebody holler, because they wanted the wire down.
'Cause they wanted the wire
Going
down.
down the road.
So it's a
hot
far
shot.
cry, yeah,
Yeah.
far cry from how they do it now.
Yeah.
You know, where
They were
It's
probably
all
only about
machine.
8 foot high.
They weren't very high, it was just
About
like
8
a
foot, I
small
think.
rod, 8 foot probably.
Yeah.
that was hard work.
it was very hard work. I worked in the hop yards, but as time progressed, it changed. When I was working in the hop yards, I walked ahead of the tractor and I cut the vines at the bottom.
At the bottom.
At the bottom, and then the tractor came along with the machinery that sorted the hops on the back, and there was somebody on the top of that got the vine at the top, and then it went through a feeder, and it shucked the
Separated,
hops
yeah.
off of the vines, which the vines went out into the field. And this was in the 60s, the late 50s, the early 60s, 1950s and 60s. And it was much different than the early years.
Well, you know, our age,
People used to.
us youngsters here.
Yeah, us
Big
youngsters.
Yeah.
Our age, that hop picking, we were too little to pick hops, actually pick it, I mean, 6, 7
Actually
years old.
pick 'em, but yes.
And I can remember kind of just getting in the way, but then later I drove a tractor that ran a hop.
That
picker,
ran a-
baled hops and
The last
dried
hop,
them and everything else.
the last hops I remember was right down here in this fence row where
Yeah,
your
they
grandpa
were
had
wild.
hops.
Yeah, they were
There was
wild.
hops in the fence row there, and that was, well, when Buck and I were growing up in the 60s, because we were always hunting pheasants down there.
Yeah, that was across the road.
So was the market for the produce like hops, peas, flax, those, did they go out of state, or did, like the hops, did they go downtown Portland to a brewery, or what, you know, where? What
Most
was
of
the
the
final
hops, they
destination?
had to be dried.
Right,
You see these old hop houses, they had a big fire
big, yes,
underneath and a cloth floor, so the smoke and everything and the heat would go through and dry them. Then we had a hop baler. Hank Johnson had a hop baler, and you shove it, had a big, like a big basket, only about 6 feet wide. You push those out the door into it, and then it would bale these hops into bales, 200 or 300 pounds apiece. Load those up, and they take them to the breweries in Portland.
in Portland.
One of the things I've read about hops is there really wouldn't hardly be the hops we have now. There wouldn't be very many because the big beer companies chemically, they make the hops in the laboratory.
Yeah.
And so what keeps hops going around St. Paul or Hubbard or
Right,
whatever,
yeah.
are Oregon
Microbrews.
microbreweries. They've saved the hop
They've
industry.
saved that
Well,
hop
they-
industry, yeah.
A lot of them wouldn't even need them. I've read that.
Interesting.
So it's a nice novelty thing to have
But we had Blitz Weinhardt back in the
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right down in Portland, right?
real hops.
Yeah, for sure. So when the settlers came, obviously there was Native Americans here, and what was the atmosphere like that? Well, you know, what was there tension? Was there, you know, what was that like? The melding together.
Dan, you could say, remember you were talking about, I
Well-
always remember the Gribble family, the kids played with the Indians.
Yeah, I think it was very congenial.
Yeah.
I don't think these were, the people, the native Indians here were anti-whites or whatever, however you want to say it.
Right.
So, like I said, the Gribbles, when they settled over there, did I say this already? But they traded a pony, a gun, and $7. And the Indian moved up the creek so they could settle that prairie. And he was their neighbor for 15 or 20 years until he died.
And great relationship.
Great
Just,
rela-
yeah, just
Yeah.
very
Yeah,
congenial. Yeah.
yeah.
But there had to have been, you know, to find artifacts that it had to be
Oh.
fairly heavily
Oh, yeah.
But I
populated.
don't think there
there-
was that many Indians after the Gribbles came.
Right.
There-
No.
And then way before, because across from Lone Elder store now was a lake. And I found a lot of Indian artifacts around the edge of that lake. But, you know, you'd find a round rock that they used to dig a hole in the ground and throw rocks at a hole, and that
Yeah,
was a good
right,
game.
right.
And bowls and with my Uncle John, Joni's dad, he looked better more than I did, but we found a lot of stuff.
John
And
was,
anyway, it was at the end of that, but that could be 400 years ago, couldn't it,
or more.
1,000 years ago?
Yeah,
Hard to say.
John was always, whenever anybody work some ground around here and
He's
get it
out there
smoothed
looking.
off and get a rain
Yeah.
after
Get
the
a
rain,
rain, yeah.
John would be out there and his
Yeah.
nose would be right to the
Just
ground
right, yeah.
walking
It's
around.
fun to find them.
Come back with a whole big
And
sack
he'd
full
find
of-
them. And he passed that along to Joni's brother brought too, so.
Well, and
Speaking of the crops, it wasn't on our fields here. I say our fields, the Harms. There's a couple big depressions in this field. There's 2 or 3 depressions in the field to the north of us. And Joni's granddad and I, in the wintertime, those would fill up with water and we'd hunt ducks. I was just a little shaker.
Wow.
So I asked Uncle Dean, I says, how come are these low spots out here in the fields? And he says, that's where we rolled the logs up and burned them so we could plant spuds.
Is that
And
right?
they-
This
So
part
that's
of
what
our
made the
ground right
depression.
On
back
the
here
ground.
in this
Yep.
trees just to the east of us here. Ken and I were talking about earlier, there's stumps in there that had 2 springboards up so they could get there where they could cut the
My
trees off.
goodness.
We played in that stump a lot as kids.
I
Had
mean, those-
big eyes.
Those trees were 10 foot around. you know,
My
diameter.
goodness. And were they mostly Doug firs or were there a
Mostly
lot
the
of
fir.
white oak
Doug
too?
fir.
Doug fir.
Doug fir.
But there was oak savannas too,
Yeah.
a lot,
The,
especially
the
in
soil,
Marks
the
Prairie.
soil in Willamette Valley, if it's really rich, it'll have Doug fir trees
Yeah.
naturally.
Naturally,
And then certain little areas like back of Silverton or right over here off of Backburg Road is a whole big oak road.
Well, Joni's dad,
And that's, the soil's not little. bit
John
different.
would talk about all the big trees around here, even in his time. There
Yeah.
was still a lot of standing timber.
Yeah, that's what they did when the settlers came here. They spent their time grubbing stumps and making.
Because that's what it
fields.
all was
Yeah.
They
all
logged them
forest.
off and that went, what, down to, what, through Malala State Park into the Willamette? Is that kind of where they went?
Well, a lot of them rolled them up and burned them, like Mike said.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
they just disposed of it.
They didn't use the lumber,
They didn't use them.
They needed the land.
I know Grandpa cut some and he'd
Interesting.
take them into town to the railroad and leave them on the railroad tracks and get paid for it. But pretty
Yeah.
soon it was more trouble than it was worth, so he just burned them.
Yeah.
There was
But this was all timbered. I mean, most of this was.
Most
all
of this was
timbered,
timber, yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I was gonna mention, I'm getting, the subject was a little bit about where the Harms came from was one man that lived in Oldham, Germany, and he came here in 1872. And that make my great grandfather and Dan and my great grandfather are the same person. That's how we get related to each other. But and he had his little brother with him who stowed away it was in a German merchant marine, and he stowed his little brother on and they found him on the way over here, so he became the cabin boy. So I guess it was friendly. But then he jumped ship in Portland.
Is
Had enough
that,
of the merchant marine, and he helped build the locks in Oregon City.
is that right? Yeah, yeah.
And then he came here, and then his son was my grandfather, and his other son, Herman, was Dan and Mike's grandfather. So that's how the Harm started.
Perfect. That was perfect.
So, I want to go back to the schoolhouse for just a second. Those were some fun conversations. What's the current condition of the schoolhouse? I understand there was a fire, February 13, what,
Oh,
20?
not a fire.
Not a fire.
No, it was in 2021, the ice storm that this area had.
Yeah, it was
And
terrible.
the trees, we've been talking about all the fir trees. Well, around Marks Prairie area, they had the white oak. And the white oak is actually becoming extinct in the area. So there is a study at Willamette University going on right now to collect the acorns from the white oak trees in order to grow more white oaks in the area. But 2 of the white oak trees that were about 200 years old were so heavily coated with ice, they fell on the back section
back
of the
section.
schoolhouse.
Okay.
Yes, we actually had a tree laying across the counter in the kitchen of the back of the schoolhouse, and that was devastating in our eyes because we had worked so hard in the last year and a half prior to that of getting the Mark Prairie Historical Society reestablished because it had been taken over by a new board of directors, and we had so many hopes for the future of the schoolhouse. It was really crushing to us, but we have been working diligently to have new architectural drawings, and we've hired a contractor, and we have had all the plans approved by the Clackamas County and by the historical, I'm not sure what it's called from Clackamas County, the Clackamas County Heritage Commission or something similar. Anyway, they've approved all this, so we are working on restoring the schoolhouse. And we need a lot of help with that, but back in the 1900s, after the school was closed down in 1946, the Mark family deeded the property and the schoolhouse to the community. So Mark's Prairie Community Club was organized, and then it became Mark's Prairie Historical Society.
Yeah.
So it was all community oriented, 4-H clubs, extension clubs, unions, and any family that wanted to gather for a graduation party, or even some of the churches had activities out there, as well as the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
So Mark's Prairie is been in existence since the schoolhouse, since 1890, we're thinking, this particular one.
Wow.
So we're 100 and what would that make, 132 years
132.
old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we're going to rebuild.
Good.
We
Good.
are going to rebuild, and we're going to have all these community activities back again. So,
Is there a place people can go to if they want to help out financially?
Yes,
Is there a
just-
website or is there a phone?
Mark
contact
Prairie
person?
Historical Society.org.
Okay.
Just go online and there's a place to donate, and we have applied for several grants. We've gotten a couple of grants already, one for $750, a
Good.
$2,500 grant.
Good.
And we received a grant from the Austin family in Newburgh for $20,000.
Fantastic.
So a lot of the local families have donated, and we do have insurance, but as we all know, insurance doesn't cover all the expenses, so we're working with them. But we have a solid board, and we are working towards bringing the school back to community use. So we're thrilled about that.
Yeah.
Really thrilled about that.
I think that's really nice too, because you thought of that, there's schools that were saved, become Grange Halls. Lone Elder, when we were kids, was a good example. A community club. We had a dinner every month. You go. I remember the potluck dinners, and there was a gun club too. It was a home of the Maxburg Gun Club. Well, I think it was one of the only schools left. The school board owned Lone Elder School, and they disposed of it now, but nobody was around to save it like Mark
Right.
Prairie, or there are lots of them around that are There's no community clubs anymore either, so that's another.
No, there's a lot of the schools in the area no longer exist. They just bulldozed them,
All gone.
which is so sad.
Yeah,
because
that's
a
why it's
part of our
important, you know.
history.
It's important to save this, you know, and to,
The history
to get
is
it
so
rebuilt.
important to
Yeah.
the community. It's just like knitting, you know, if you're a knitter, you want to know where does the yarn come from? Well, the sheep, which
No,
we've had a
for
lot
sure.
of,
All the people that ever listen to this thing too, they gotta learn, the older we get, the more fanatic we get about the old days. I
yeah.
think of Macksburg as a town.
One thing about the Lone Elder Community Club then, it was a function of the people within the community most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And like Ken said, they'd have potlucks and parties, and the gun club would meet there annually to have their
Turkey shoot.
annual meeting or turkey shoots.
I remember
But
the crab
I
feeds.
can remember when I was a younger kid, people used to have New Year's Eve parties there. And I can remember it, Rufus and Francie Kraxberger staying overnight there, because everybody in the community was at that
Was that
party.
there?
And you could go outside at midnight, there'd be music playing,
Yep.
guns going off,
Sure.
hooting and hollering.
Dynamite,
Dynamite.
It was just
Well, I think a lot now. I look at how things function and everything, and I'm fortunate to live out at Elliott Prairie and right across from the Iversons, and it feels like that. You know, I've only lived there 32 years, but I feel like there's a community there, and I think, you know, it's easy to get for it to be gone, the community aspect. And you tell me, and I want to hear from each one of you about this. Why do you think it's important to hold on and to pass on, so to speak, the torch of history, so that we don't forget, and so that maybe, just maybe, there's a chance that we'll continue to live as community, you know? I mean, I think it's important. Why do you think it's important?
I think as I've watched history go, I see people trying to change history. You look at things, they're going to take down this statue or this. That's part of our history that we grew up with.
good or bad.
And if nobody will document what the history was and what we can see history now, it's going to be gone.
Yeah.
We're going to have generations come up that have no idea.
True.
It's getting pretty bad that my grandson's now a sophomore in high school. A year or two ago, we were talking about the farmers, where food comes from and all that. He says, Grandpa, you don't believe this, but he says, there's kids in high school that think chocolate milk come from brown cows.
I believe that. You know,
So, you know, we're getting so removed from the farm where food is produced and where it's going to and how we harvest it and all of that. And Macksburg is a farming community.
yes.
Oh, definitely.
Marks Prairie was a farming community. And basically there were small farms, there weren't big corporate farms, quote unquote. They were family farms. Most of them were subsistence living. They raised their families and stuff. Another family that's out here in Macksburg that we haven't thought of is the Brush family. My grandmother was a Brush. They were located just south of the Kraxberger plantation, whatever you want to call it. But they were there a long time, people that were here back, you know, turn of the century type thing and before. And the Etzels were here. They were, the school ground at Macksburg was on ground that the Etzels had. But those are people that in the area that have been here for a long time. The Herkamp family was another one that was here for a long time. So the Macksburg area, basically, you start naming those names off, and they're German. This was a German community.
Yes, it was.
Interesting.
I didn't go to Sunday school for a while until my mother said they're going to preach the German services in English, then you can go to Sunday school. But it wasn't until World War II come along that the church services in Maxburg
Well,
were preached in German.
And they had two services, one in German and one in English.
Yeah.
They did.
And then the people stand outside the church, speak German. You know, my mother spoke German. My older brother spoke German. Anyway, it was German.
Yeah. Ken, what about you? Why do you think it's important to hang on, hold
Well,
on to our history?
You know, I think about that. There are a lot of people could just say it's not important, and I suppose because things change, and change isn't always bad, of course. But I somehow don't, maybe I'm not expressing this right, but the good times we had, the lifestyle, and that's what's important to me. I think is, well, I can remember my brother and I at 10 o'clock at night, my twin brother and I riding our bicycles clear over to where Liberal is now, and we go in Walt and Bergie Zacker's barn and catch pigeons in the dark, because you could put a gunny sack over the outlet to the barn and scare the pigeons. They'd fly into the gunny sack. Then we bring them home for no reason at all, except we had about 50 pigeons.
I can remember those.
Just to do it.
I mean, and you take them to school. Sometimes you get one that was, and you know, anyway, pretty soon they lived in a brooder house we had. You'd leave them in there long enough, then that became their home, and you turn them loose when they just lived there then. Well, I don't know that many people do that now. I mean that as just one little tiny bit of the fun we had, and if anything, it's fun to talk about it. I can't be specific, but the lifestyles then were something to emulate, something to pay attention to and try to follow.
Well, it wasn't
No.
like it was, there wasn't a lot of modern conveniences, to be sure, but the simplicity of life had to have been attractive. As you look back now, it has to be attractive.
Things they had too, like Rudy Etzel. Some of you might remember that name because he lived to be 104 years old.
Wow.
But Rudy and Olga Etzel lived by the Mackburg School. And I can remember going to their housewarming. It shows how old I am. Going to their housewarming when I was a kid. And everybody was at that housewarming. Now, the last 5 years, they've torn that house down and built a new one. But once the house be built and torn down.
Sure.
Like the grain elevator in Canby, too. You know, watched
No,
it
yeah.
built and torn down.
Well, one thing about growing up in this area is when I was a kid, you knew everybody.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
even as a little kid, you knew everybody in the area, and they knew you.
Yeah.
Good or bad, right?
Good or bad, you better watch what you were doing, because if you weren't, I mean, if you didn't know them, chances are they were a stranger, because
Yeah.
around here, you just knew everybody, and
Yeah.
if you
That's
weren't,
right. I
probably
thought
related to most.
the world of Glenn's dad, Ferd, but he also got after me and my brother for lighting the sulfur fire in his hop house. We were just lighting a fire, get warm, but we didn't put it out when we left.
Oh.
But it didn't cause any trouble, thank goodness, because Ferd came and saved it. But stupid kid then.
Yeah, for sure. Judy, what about you?
Well, I think it's important to save our history. A lot like Ken, it's the ease of life back then that we had. You know, you could, like Ken also said, you could be outdoors all day long at the neighbors or at your grandparents or wherever. Your parents would never check on you.
Nope.
They'd never go hunting for you to find out where you were, if you were safe or whatnot. And we just felt safe back then. And I always wish that we could be that way now, that you would feel safe if your children were outside playing. But also it was parts of your history, like you think about wrapping the maypole, which we did every year at Marks Prairie. Harvey probably remembers that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we would have a big ceremony where everybody was dressed in crepe paper dresses, and you would wrap the maypole, and we had a big ceremony, and that was really special. And holding the 4-H meetings at Marks Prairie Schoolhouse. We had 4-H sewing, we had cooking classes, we had livestock, especially Jersey, because the Mark family had the big Jersey farm. And being able to preserve all that history, to know that that was when 4-H started, was back in the 40s and 50s, and it's carried on now because you go to the 4-H building at Clackamas County Fair,
Yeah.
and you can see all the work that the young
Yeah.
people did, but we started doing that all back in the 40s and 50s. And we also had barn dances. That was a big thing. I'm sure they had them over here in this area too, especially the Harms. But we would have them in the haymow of the Wolfer barn, and all the neighbors would gather there, and we get an accordion player, a banjo player, and a violinist, and everybody would meet in the haymow on a Saturday night and drink beer that was all homemade and wine that was homemade and just have a good time. So those are the things that need to be remembered.
Sure.
That's
Yeah.
what started.
Well, you mentioned 4-H. I can remember was in a 4-H club for a short time, but my brother and I'd take our 22, get on the bus in the morning, school bus with a 22 rifle. Didn't even have a case on it. Set it in the bus, take it to school. On the bus, come back home. We got off down at the flax plant, and they had one of the buildings with a 4-H gun rifle thing. You imagine that, taking your
I
rifle?
can't.
No.
No, they'd be put in prison. 8 years old. You know,
Paying
now,
attention.
right? You know, crazy. Glenn, I want to go back to you for a second because I really never asked you the question, but you piped in and talked about you knew everybody and it was real community. Do you want to just to expound on that a little bit? Knowing everybody, there's some safety in that too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you just felt safe no matter where you were. You knew where you were at. You knew whose property you were on. You know, if you were riding your bike or something happened, you knew that you had somebody here or somebody there that could help you out.
That helped.
So,
Yeah.
That reminds me of another thing, helping out. Maxburg had the church, this is still a Lutheran church, and it had G.W. Scramlin's store, which was a store like
General
liberal
merchandise.
store now, general
Yeah.
merchandise. There's some left, Yoder store, liberal store, there's one up back at Beaver Creek. They had, the downstairs was a store that sold everything, literally.
Had a
Upstairs
post
was a
office.
dance hall. And I could remember that the store was closed when I was a kid, so it was closed many years ago. But they just closed it and walked out, shut the door and left. So we had permission to play in there, and they had Wheaties boxes still on the shelf, and rubber boots,
Wow.
and glass with flaws in it, candy case glass, and a rock or something. They make the nicest shatter when you threw a rock and broke it.
Oh,
We had permissions, okay, so there's
Yeah.
another stupid thing again, coming
Yeah.
back. But we played in that store, and across the road was Eric Mertz's blacksmith shop. And he had 5 daughters who were, Yost, pot rats,
How we doing?
Kirkham,
Hawks,
anyway, and they were all around the country. So,
Cox.
and his dad
Adams.
was a preacher for a while at the Lutheran church. But Eric was everybody loved Eric Mertz. If our bikes break down, we'd haul them up there, and Eric fixed them, no charge.
He could make
Farmers
anything.
brought everything in there, welded plowshare, and that was really the heart of Maxburg, if you wanted. And he was just a friendly guy. Half the time he wouldn't charge anybody anything. He just
Just did it.
Talking about Eric, I remember Eric as a kid. Everybody took their plowshares, they put hard stuff in them, pound them out so they suck right when
Yeah.
you would plow. And everybody had a sickle mower then. And he would go through and put the new blades in and sharpen them and all that. And people would come from miles to have their plowshares done from Mount Angel, from all
Is that
over.
right? Yeah.
And this man, he was the most impressive man.
He was.
He was an old fella when I knew him, and he had arms on him that almost touched his toes, and he had hands. It's hard to imagine. He had huge hands. He had fingers about
Just-
that big around.
Yeah.
And in his day, he was a horseshoer, and he was in his day, he must have been the stoutest man alive, because he was this thick through the chest and this broad. He had old beech nut chew in his mouth, and it'd be dripping down the corners.
He wasn't very tall either.
No, that's what I mean. And then he did a lot of forging then, so he had his coals going and his billows and stuff. And to this day, I just, you know, most people take an iron to stir that around. He'd take them paws and just get in there and move that stuff
He
around.
had calluses.
He was the most impressive man that I can remember.
The blacksmith shop's still there in the house that he had.
Crazy.
And then his daughter Helen had polio with one of his daughters, and she never married. And I think Mrs. Eric's wife must have died. I never remember
Young.
many years
I
before.
remember.
Young.
So he lived with his daughter, and his daughter took care of him. But then the guy that owned the
Scrambling.
store I'm
Scrambling.
talking, the store I'm talking about, G.W. Scrambling, he gave his house, or his son gave his house to
Helen.
Helen, Eric's daughter, when he died. So
Across the street.
that's the kind of stuff that went on too. He just gave the house to Helen because she was a nice person, and so was her dad.
There was a store there at Maxburg, right next to the Scramblins, and the blacksmith shop had a gas pump in there at the time. And you could go in there, walk into school, come back. If you had a nickel, you could get a candy bar,
Bottle
a
of
candy
pop.
cone, bottle of pop. And then in the back, he put a pool table in. Well, I was told I was never to go in that pool room. I'd stay up front, but you could, but as I got a little older, all the farmers around there at noon or sometime were shooting pool.
Wintertime especially.
It would be a learning experience just watching and listening.
I remember going to the Maxburg store on Wednesday night when Ezra Charles and Rocky Marciano fight. That's one of the, and nobody had a TV. I was in the eighth grade, I think, before we ever had a TV. But we go to, I'm rambling here, but we'd go to Mike and Dan's grandmother's place, Aunt
She had
Lizzie,
one of
my
them.
Aunt Lizzie, their grandmother, and she had a TV, a Philco, a blonde TV. Only TV in the country, that and the Maxburg store. But
Wow.
the Maxburg store, I remember going to that fight as a kid, and that had to be quite a while ago. We can look it up. Whenever Ezra Charles and Rocky Marciano fought, Wednesday night,
Wednesday night.
down to the fight at Lawrence.
Buck and I bought a lot of BBs at Macbeth. That's all I know.
We picked up beer bottles, my brother and I, too. You'd get
A penny.
for penny candy
Penny,
and then go
yeah,
to the store.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we never
Trading.
thought of it as being anything but normal. Just
Crazy. Dan, what about you? Why do you think it's important to?
Well,
to
I'm a little,
hold on?
I'm a little biased because my roots are here.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
my feet are in the ground. So, I think a lot of that has already been said about what it means to be a community. And like Glenn mentioned, you knew everybody, and you did know everybody. And it just wasn't local. It was miles in circumference, you know. And I got a little bit more of it, I think, than most because my dad was a livestock man. And he would, so if anybody needed a chore or an emergency, they called my dad. So I got to go with him to a lot of people's places. You know, either it was dehorning cows or docking lambs and castrating lambs or all that kind of stuff.
he was the number one vet, and he wasn't a vet.
No, he wasn't a vet.
He wasn't a vet.
He just a
But he
livestock
knew
man.
vets work, didn't he?
Right. And so I got to realize a lot of older people too. I can remember going to George Ziegler's to do his lambs. It was a favorite place for Dad because in every barn he had there, he had a whiskey jug stuck up. No matter where you went on this place, he had a bottle someplace around that there. And to Shorty Jackson's, who was Bill Jackson, and doing his lambs, and I can remember, I think I was 12 or 13 years old, and I had my first stubby of beer
Is that
after
right? Yeah.
after we did lambs, you know.
Yeah. Did you like it?
I did, and that's the problem. But yes,
You know, we never thought of that. We'd haul hay for a farmer, and they'd give us we'd have a beer for
Yeah.
lunch.
Yeah.
And we're 15 or 16.
Yep.
or they'd feed you. You know, it was a totally different way of life. I guess I'm going to brag because I think I grew up during the best part
Yeah.
of life.
We all did.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all did.
Where Dad would go do this thing and it would be thanks, Hap.
Yeah.
You know, we'll catch you later or nothing. There was no, you owe me this or you owe me
Yeah.
that or
No,
this
no,
or
no.
that, you know.
It was community.
There was a lot of trade. If somebody needed some help getting you had your farming done and somebody needed a help. I mean, it was just the way it was.
One thing I thought was interesting too, my mother, who grew up in this right here too, said we didn't know there was a depression because the farmers were self-sufficient and everything. But our grandparents, Dan and Mike's parents, his dad and uncle, they had Harms Brothers livestock, and they'd go to show animals at fairs around the country, and like the Cow Palace in San Francisco, and you had that big sheep trophy that your dad won.
That was the 39 World's Fair.
Yeah, the 1939 World's Fair, and he had the grand champion. He had the grand champion.
Lincoln
sheep.
Ram.
Yeah, Lincoln Ram. But they did that, and it paid the taxes. My grandpa said, well, you know, Hap and Jack, they made their money from, they had to make some money to pay the taxes. And my grandfather had a trap line, just ran, and skunks, people bought skunks, believe that or not.
Wow.
Paid the taxes. That's the only thing you needed money for, was to pay the taxes.
Pay taxes. Yeah.
During the Depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mars Prairie, it was the Peters family. They did a lot of skunk trapping, and they lived over on Lone Elder Road, and Fred and Les Peter went to school at Marks Prairie. And on their way to school one day, what do you know, they ran across some skunks that they had caught in their traps in the fields. And so they were dealing with the skunks in the traps on the way to school, and they walked across the field. They didn't go around the roads.
Yeah.
They walked from the Peter place across the field to the school. Well, when they got to school and the teacher took one whiff of them, she said, "You're dismissed for the day, go home." And needless to say, they were thrilled.
No, for sure. I'd go that way every day then.
Yeah.
That was one other thing they did, my grandpa said, that once a year, you'd take pitchforks, get on the horse and take a couple pitchforks, go down to the Molalla River, which is this way from here, and get the year's salmon with the pitchfork out of the Molalla River.
They're right there.
Is that
Yeah, a
that?
two-time
Have you
pitchfork.
ever
Time
run?
pitchfork.
Yeah.
Bundle fork, they call
And
it.
you'd, they'd smoke them, put them in the smokehouse.
Sure. Yeah. Amazing.
Did they used to take the pelts into vineyards?
Somewhere in Canby, I remember, yeah.
Wasn't it vineyards that they
vineyards.
sold them to?
Vineyards. Is that why Mrs. Vineyard had so many
Could be.
furs?
That might be, we used to take chitim bark some different places too.
Chitim
That's another
bark.
story.
I remember
Yeah,
you stripping
chitim bark.
chitim bark.
Yeah.
My
Bark,
grandparents were in Prattham, you know,
Oh,
down
okay.
in Howe Prairie, and that's where I was born on there. And I remember stripping chitim bark
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
getting money for
Make a
that.
little tool so you can
Yeah,
peel
just
it around.
stripped right off. Yeah, yeah. Harv, what about you? Why do you think it's important to make sure that we don't lose our history?
Well, those guys just said it all. It's history, so.
Sure.
But, I don't know what I can add to that. The fact that it's history, I think it's very important to maintain and keep it alive. Yeah.
Yesterday was Daytona 500, and I got together with a bunch of people at a home in Tualatin. And a lot of the people that were there are the people that I rode to Sturgis with and met in Sturgis. And it was a really special time. I'd never watched, Daytona before, so that's the first time I ever watched that. But it was more than that. It was a coming together of people that I knew and loved and appreciated and got to know. And when you were talking about community, that's how I felt yesterday in that environment. And but I'm sure in those days, you probably didn't gather around a television except for a Marciano fight. But you didn't need it. You didn't need that. You didn't probably need a reason to come together. You did it because that's what you did. That was the culture of the day. And I listened to you tell the stories, and then there's probably 100,000 more stories to tell. But I hope and pray that as a society we don't lose track of what's important. And I think all that you've talked about is the people. I mean, the most of what you've talked about, I mean, people were always, doing something, whatever, but it was always the people and getting together and enjoying one another and getting to know. I'm sure there were tough times, but when I listen to you, I think, man, those had to have been good days when you could rely on each other and when you could love each other, and no one was perfect, but man, you it didn't take much, like what'd you call it, a maypole, to get together and have a festival and
I think some people don't experience that. Like we'd have a family Christmas party.
Yeah.
And I can remember I'd slide under the piano. My mother's playing the piano, and Joni Harm's dad, John, is playing the accordion. And everybody sang, and I just thought all families did that. And obviously they didn't. But
they didn't.
And Joni, has made a career of
certainly
music that it was just around us all the time, family. I sing in the barbershop chorus too, which is just a lot of fun for you.
Yeah.
But my point was that it was getting together. Yeah, people.
Absolutely getting together. Speaking of Joni and music, she on this particular album that she did, CD, is called. There's a song called "Harm's Way," and I think there's some stories in that, of some of the things that you were talking about. And again, probably 1,000, 100,000 more stories. But I just want to tell you how much fun it's been listening to your thoughts and your memories. And is there anything else before we close this down that there's just like, man, I gotta talk about this one thing, anything like that?
Well, I just wanted to add about Mark's Prairie.
Yes.
We have the schoolhouse there, but also that monument in the front that a lot of people have been curious about. There's actually 8 of the Mark descendants that are buried under that monument. And they were originally on the Mark farms. And after the school closed down in 1946, and the students were sent into Canby to go to school, the family had those remains moved from their farms over to underneath that monument. And the monument was erected from the headstones that had been on each of the farms where the different descendants from the Mark family
Wow.
had been buried. And that's why the monument is shaped like it is, with all the separate headstones on it. And was officially named by the county as Mark Memorial Park. And it is a historical landmark. Both the cemetery portion and the schoolhouse are in the historical registry of the state of Oregon. So you'll
Well,
find
thank
that.
you.
Yeah, the state of Oregon. So
Good.
I think that's really important to the history, because a lot of people have no clue that there's actually a cemetery there on the
That's-
premises. So
Pretty cool.
that's an important part
It
to
is.
remember.
Yes.
And
One of
it,
the other things, she's talking about cemeteries, is the Gribble Cemetery, located on Gribble Road, that the first grave is there in 1854, 5 years before Oregon became a state. And that was dedicated from our great-great-grandmother, donated that 5 acres of ground.
That'll be darn.
And basically it was for the Gribble family, but then it was surrounding neighbors that lived there were also being buried there. So there's quite a few families buried there, but started out as the Gribble Cemetery, and it is in one of the historical heritage cemeteries, whatever you call it.
adding to what Mike said, it was dedicated sort of out of necessity. There was 2 young girls by the name of Fish that had passed away, and nobody had a place to bury them.
Wow.
So he dedicated off 2 acres for that.
Wow.
That's how that
That's
became.
how that became.
And the sad part of that, to me, is that out of all that property that the Gribbles settled on, that's the last 2 acres that are in the Gribble name.
Wow. Wow.
So it's pretty sacred.
So it's sacred
Yeah.
ground. Yeah, to be sure.
Well, I was just saying, not many homesteads, that's a good example, not many homesteads are intact. And obviously, I don't think there's any that are, but because people, sold parts of them. And like I grew up on a little corner of this homestead that my grandfather gave to my dad and mom when they got married, the property, here, build a house here. And, but this one's still owned by the Harms family.
Yeah.
So that's kind of unique.
Yeah, it is.
Nobody left.
What a good time. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for all of your time. A couple people I want to thank also. Gordon Christensen behind the camera, who does all the dirty work and puts this all together. Thank you so much. Certainly Frank Cutsforth, who has worked so hard. And I remember having original conversations at the shop, Frank, about the possibility of pulling this together, and here it is happening right now. That's very cool. The Harms for letting us film here and tape this. We're so grateful. Don't forget, if you have never been to the Canby Depot, it's a great historical place. You'll see a lot of things that we've talked about there. And thank you, the players, for all of the memories and the good words. And I think coming out of this, listen, just be about community. Just be about people, and learn to, even if you're in a tight, little neighborhood, that's your community. Make it your community. Do things. Get to know your neighbor. And there's no reason not to, right? You've heard the great stories of what it can be like. Well, let's have that. Let's do that. Thank you so much, and it's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Mallory.
very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
What Christensen are you?
Grandpa Grandpa Harms built this homestead with hard-working hands. He knew he'd found a piece of heaven when he first looked on this land. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but the harder it got, the more he'd pray. He'd gladly do the work of 10 if need be, when another man would surely walk away, never in harm's way. He and Grandma raised a family the same way they raised their crops, with tenderness and patience and love that never stops. It was mighty hard work around the harvest, picking apples, cutting wood, and hauling hay, gathering up the goods out of the garden, 'cause absolutely nothing went to waste, never in harm's way. In the evenings we'd gather around the table after a hard work's day was done, giving thanks that we are able, and there's plenty enough for everyone. Took a walk on Sunday morning and smelled the new plowed earth, remembering how Grandpa loved to watch the soil give birth. And sometimes it still isn't easy, but the time.
Your voice and your stories. From local events to creative productions, we bring Clackamas County to life. Learn, create, and belong. Right here on Jackson Street in Oregon City.